Spanner. Bye. Chris Lowry. Spanner. The party downstairs was getting noisy. Jim Cabot tried not to listen, but couldn't help it. The happy yells and loud talking people celebrating the new millennium at his house couldn't be shut out. He was a good-looking kid, with sandy-colored hair and clear intelligent eyes. His mother had been a beauty queen in her youth, and his father a starting quarterback in college. He didn't have his dad's athletic build yet, but he did have his mom's looks, at least that's what his mother told him. He really hoped he didn't look like a girl, and kept his haircut short to be sure no one made any mistakes. Besides their good looks, mom and dad gave them something else, a once-in-a-generation brain. Jim Cabot was a genius. They had tested him once, when he was young, and he could remember every question. He didn't miss one. He had a knack for picking up on things, and making connections. His mom was smart, but no better than just above average. His dad was a hard worker and dedicated to his job as a lawyer, but he was just a normal guy too. Somehow their combination had made one of this century's smart guys. They coddled his abilities, feeding his hunger for knowledge, his appetite for learning everything. Everything except social skills. Other children were intimidated or just not interested in smart guys. So he spent a lot of time by himself reading, inventing and learning. He had more book knowledge than most people learn in a lifetime. He was working on learning how to apply it to his life. His parents had posted a combination family and friends party to celebrate the new year. He had been with them laughing and smiling, helping his mother to refill the punch bowl and snack dishes. He always tried to be helpful. His aunt and uncle and their 3 children, the cousins, were there. As well as 4 couples from Dad's office and 3 from his mother's job. They had brought their children to an all-out family party to ring in the new year. The adults stayed in the living room and kitchen, moving from the snack table to the long bar where the punch bowl was set up. The kids congregated in the family room, watching movies on a large television screen and fighting over a game system on the smaller one. Jim tried to talk to them, but his oldest cousin, Ted, turned them all against him. It was hard enough playing host to strangers without someone sabotaging every effort. Nerd Bird, Ted called him. It was a stupid nickname, and Jim hated it. "Hey, Nerd Bird. Go get us something to drink." "I'm not your maid," Jim said. Ted jumped up off of the couch and held Jim against the wall. He was older by almost a year, but he played junior varsity football at the middle school. He had Jim by 30 pounds and was 3 inches taller. His dad had told him that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. But that was when they were playing touch frisbee in the backyard, and didn't really apply when the bigger ones were holding you against the wall. "I want you to get us sodas and bring them in here," growled Ted with potato chip stale breath. One of Dad's friends from work had brought their daughter, Melody, with them. She was 13, just like Jim, but didn't want to talk to him. She spent most of the night laughing at Ted's stupid jokes, and batting her eyelashes up at him. Jim was pretty sure that Ted was showing off for her, playing the part of the big bad John, except that he acted this way every time the family got together. "You like helping your mom, don't you?" Ted asked. "You help her with the punch. Now you're going to help us." He shoved up Jim toward the door. "Get it," he said. Jim adjusted his wrinkled shirt, trying to think of something to say, or something to do. He drew a blank. It was ironic to him that he was so socially underdeveloped since he was so smart. Everyone said so. He had been advanced to letter grades in elementary school, from 1st to 3rd grade, but his mom put him back after a disastrous first 9 weeks. He didn't fit in with the other children, who made fun of his age, his speech, the way he dressed. It was nothing new to Jim, who just kept doing the class work as fast as a teacher could handle book, and reading on his own when she didn't. His mother didn't like the way the kids treated her special little man, so she put him back into his old classroom. Jim never heard they treated him the exact same way. "All right," Jim told Ted. He went into the kitchen, slipping past the older people as they talk. They didn't notice them. He put ice in the colored party glasses, picking a green one that was larger than the rest. He put the glasses on a tray and filled him soda. He carried the tray back down the hallway but stopped at the bathroom door. Jim slipped inside unnoticed and opened the medicine cabinet. He took a powdered laxative, poured it into the big green glass, and started with his finger. "Serves them right," he muttered under his breath. A loud knock shook the door. Jim almost spilled the tray. "Anyone in there?" An adult yelled through the door. Jim pushed it open. "All done," he smiled. The grown-up hurried past him without a word. Jim proceeded down the hall into the den. "Soda," he announced. Ted grabbed the large green glass and gulped it all down. Just as Jim expected. "Go get me more," Ted ordered. Jim smiled. "Sure." He got another soda for Ted, stopping in the bathroom again on his way back. His father wasn't the type of man to raise his voice when he got angry. Instead, he lowered it, speaking in slow, deliberate sentences. It was almost worse that way, like some dangerous animal that growled. Jim hated to disappoint his father. "I am disappointed in you," said Dad. "I'm sorry," Jim lowered his head. "I don't think you are," Dad continued. "If you were, you wouldn't have done it." They stood in the hallway outside of the bathroom. Jim was surrounded by his mother and father, Ted's mother and father, and Melody. The party was still going on in the living room. The kids were still playing in the den. But this small group stood outside of the bathroom and listened to Ted's loud moans. "Honey?" his mother said through the door. Ted moaned. "What did you do to him?" "Why do you think it was me?" Jim asked. His father wasn't convinced that was one of the problems with being gifted. It was rare to get away with anything. Once, in school, he had accessed the computer system and changed the clocks. Each class lasted 10 minutes, according to the bells. He also had a fire drill, with emergency crews racing to the school. Just a small payback for losing recess when a bully pushed him around. The principal wouldn't listen to reason. He gave both boys detention so he wouldn't show favoritism to anyone. He left Jim alone in his office while he walked the other boy back to class. The next day a small timed computer virus invaded the clock system. It was chaotic. The school authorities could never prove he did it. But his father knew. "Honestly, Jim, why can't we just have a good time for once?" his dad asked. "Is he going to be all right?" his aunt sobbed. "Of course he's going to be all right," Jim answered. "I gave him a dose of his own medicine. He'll be back to normal in about 12 hours. "Normal," his aunt wailed. She beat on the door. "Ted? Teddy? Are you hurt, honey?" "I don't like this," his dad said. Jim looked at his mother, hoping she would come to his rescue. "Was it that bad?" she asked, putting her hand on his shoulder. "Not as bad as that," he said, nodding toward the bathroom door. Ted moaned inside. "I think it's funny," said Melody. "I mean, he was being a jerk." Jim looked at his parents with pleading eyes. "I said that," he said. "I think you should spend the rest of your night in your room," his dad warned. "That's not fair," he argued. "I'll miss the new year." "Maybe you should have thought of that before you did this to your cousin." "But Dad." "Go." His dad used a tone of voice that Jim knew well. Sometimes when you know more than your parents about something, they resent it, and use a certain voice when talking. His dad used that voice a lot. Jim trudged up the stairs to his room. His room was his sanctuary, a castle of his own making. It was large, and quiet, the walls covered with posters of everything imaginable. Dinosaurs, a world map, the galaxy, Albert Einstein sticking his tongue out. He had a table of elements on one wall, above a large computer, and a poster of cheerleaders across from it over his bed. There were toys, piled neatly in an oak chest. Board games were stacked in the stuffed bookcases which overflowed with books onto the floor. He had a workbench from one wall to his closet, with several unidentifiable toys, machines, and appliances in varying stages of assembly. His room was a place to get away from the world. There was no one there to care how we talked, or looked, or acted. No one to bully him, or take Ted's side over his. No one to have a party with, or ring in the new year. Jim was all alone. He sat at his workbench toying with his latest Christmas gift, a tablet. He was adjusting the connections in the back, adding memory and software, upgrading the systems to a program he had written himself. He had been working on a physics program, a statistical model on Einstein's theory of relativity. Jim had gutted the computer and rebuilt the programming to run the models faster than the eye could see, almost as fast as light travels. There was something soothing when he watched his big screen monitor fill up with the numbers, using his imagination to think of traveling as fast as his computer could compute. "One day," he muttered while he tinkered. "One day I'll build a spaceship that will travel that fast." He connected the tablet to his CPU to build an extension of the programming. He downloaded the program, and set it to run on the smaller tablet screen. It was only a 6x7 unit, but the processing speed was fast and he was satisfied with the results. He wasn't sure of the practical applications of a handheld model of relativity, but he was sure that it would win the school science fair. Teachers always liked his inventions, even the ones that didn't work. He scribbled an equation in the inside cover of the tablet, reset the back of the unit and snapped into place. "Ta-da," he said. As usual, there was no applause with his success. Of course, he wasn't sure what it would do. The plan was for the screen to fill with row after row of numbers, all of the probable answers to a series of equations that he had entered into the computer. He hit the on switch. The screen lit up. Jim touched the tip of his finger to the screen, selected a program and opened the file. The equation E equals mc squared popped up. He touched enter. Just as he hoped, a second equation followed, then a third, and numbers filled the screen. Row after row flashing down. Jim smiled and gave a victory punch to the air. The screen started to fade out. A message popped up. "Battery is low. You will lose any unsaved information. Switch to AC power now." No, he said. He scrambled to the mess on the workbench looking for a power cord. It was buried under a pile of parts. He snaked it into the wall socket and plugged the jack into the back of the tablet. "I need a bigger battery," he said. Across the room in his pile of toys he saw a remote control race car. Aha, he thought. He ran across the room and carried the RC car back to his workbench. He had the shell off in no time and disengaged the battery unit from inside the remote control car. He held it up to the back of the tablet. It was almost a perfect match. He dug through the different screws in separate containers, but nothing would work on the delicate casing. He decided to use the all-purpose universal connector, duct tape. He tore off a piece and ripped it into long strips. He wrapped it around the top, bottom and middle of the unit and leaned back in his seat to admire his handiwork. "Not bad," he said. He plugged the battery into a supercharger. It would be ready in 15 minutes. The clock on his wall read 11:15. He decided to go to bed. He didn't care if the new year came and went without him. The world has existed for a long, long time before he got there, and would go on for a billion years more after he left. He knew that much. There was really nothing special about New Year's anyway. It was just a pagan holiday that someone adopted a long time ago, a habit that had become the celebrated norm. Jim lay down on his bed, and closed his eyes. He fell asleep wishing he was downstairs. "Okay everybody, get ready." He heard his mother's voice from downstairs. He climbed out of bed and moved to the workbench. 10, 9. The battery on his tablet was fully charged. He unplugged it and opened the program. 8, 7. What a way to spend New Year's, he muttered as he ran the program again. The numbers glowed on the screen. 6, 5, 4, 3. Happy freaking New Year, he told himself as the house erupted in cheers underneath him. He wondered if Melody kissed Ted. Outside, he could hear celebrations up and down the block. Somewhere, fireworks cracked in the sky. He turned back to his bed and tumbled through a glowing electric blue hole in the floor. Into a new world. He tumbled down a small hillside meadow, toward a pristine lake. He caught himself on a patch of long weeds and pulled up short before the water. He lay still for a moment, working to catch his breath and trying to determine what happened. One moment he was in his room, mere seconds before, listening to the rest of the world celebrate the new year. He turned on his tablet to check the program, and now he was alone in a meadow in the middle of the woods. Jim sat up and looked around. He wasn't alone. A lone figure kneeled beside the water 20 yards away. The person had his back to Jim, but he could see they didn't have a shirt on. The figure reached into the lake and scooped the water up to splash on their face. He rubbed his eyes and tried to will himself awake. "What am I doing here?" he thought. "I'm still asleep," he decided. "It's a dream. I dreamed about getting up and I'm dreaming this now." The decision made, he stood up and went to investigate. He was a great dreamer, with visions full of vivid and often bizarre details. He kept meticulous journal of his dreams in the drawer of his nightstand, jotting down anything you could remember during the first foggy moments after waking up. This dream would be a good experiment because so far, it was fantastic. He could feel the heat of a warm sun on his skin, felt the wind rustle through the hairs on his arm. The colors seemed brighter than normal, vibrant and full of hue and depth. The air smelled cleaner. He couldn't remember ever being able to smell in a dream before, though he supposed it was possible. The human mind was an incredible machine, and the mysteries of how it worked was explored every day. He felt the wind on his face and smelled the damp odor of the water. The lake wasn't much of a lake, more of a small pond, stretching across the meadow almost 50 feet before it disappeared into a small copse of woods. It was wide here near the bottom of the hill but narrow where it slipped between the trees. A well-worn beaten path ran alongside the lake. He quietly marched toward the bathing figure. The sun was just past the zenith of noon, blazing down in heated fury. "More proof," he said as he walked. He falling asleep at night in winter. In this dream it was daylight and warm. "Excuse me," he called to the figure. She turned around and whipped a long sword from a scabbard on the ground and squared off on Jim. "Merde," she shouted. "Sorry," Jim stammered and tried to look away. He felt his cheeks flush instantly scarlet as heat rushed to them. She didn't seem to care about modesty. She glared at him and leveled the sword in his heart. Her hair was buzzed short on the sides and only a little longer on the top. She wore thick leggings that hid her thin legs, and a tunic or long shirt was on the ground in front of her along with what looked like a leather vest. "Inglay," she spat and advanced on Jim with the pointy tip of her broadsword. "Yes, I speak English," Jim backpedaled. He held up two hands to show he was unarmed. He took one step back for every step she moved closer, like a bizarre dance. She bent down and scooped up the leather vest, donned it, but never took her eyes off him. "I'm having a dream," he said to her in a calm, logical voice. He hoped it sounded soothing. Attractive women with swords aimed at him needed to be soothed, he reasoned. "It's the most intense dream I've ever had, though I think I read Leonardo da Vinci wrote that his dreams were almost lifelike. Maybe this is what he meant?" She shook her head and spat at him in French. "I don't speak your foul tongue." Jim had studied French, but he could barely understand her usage. Her pronunciation was archaic and her mouth seemed full of mush as she spoke. "Why wouldn't I understand you in my dream?" he asked. Her eyes doubled in size as she glared. "Inglay." She leapt toward him, sword arched high and racing down. Jim shrieked. It was not a cowardly high-pitched screech, but a very dignified grunt cut short by the ground rising up to meet his buttocks. Her blade slammed into another that whizzed just where his head had been. Jim looked up at a small mountain of a man, covered in heavy steel armor. His dirty face was hidden behind a grilled visor. The man stepped over Jim and advanced on the tiny girl. "Bloody hell," the knight grinned. He and the girl battled across the meadow. She gave ground before massive blows from his short, thick sword, but dodged each blow with finesse and grace. The knight knocked her sword away and darted in close to her, relying on his heavy armor to turn her blade. He smiled in victory. She dropped her sword and rolled forward to grab him by the armor plates. She collapsed backwards, lifted her feet to his stomach and flipped the knight over her. He landed with a clatter of metal on his back and gasped as the breath was knocked out of him. The girl jumped up and picked up the knight's fallen sword. He looked like a turtle flipped on its shell as he grunted and groaned, tried to turn over. The girl stood over him, gripped his sword by the pommel and slammed it down. The knight stopped squirming. Jim looked away as she stabbed the man. His stomach roiled, and if he had eaten dinner, he was sure it would be sprayed on the ground in front of him. She came at him, the knight's sword dripped a trail of blood and gore on the green carpet of grass. "Please," he stuttered in French. "I want to wake up." She halted her advance, the sword aimed at his throat. "Is this just a dream?" he asked. It didn't feel like a dream. But dreams felt real, sometimes, so he couldn't be sure. And why he would dream of this beautiful killer he couldn't imagine. Her pause gave him a moment and his brain kicked in. He struggled to remember syntax and construction. Foreign languages were great, but unless you used it every day, it was hard to remember more than a few key words and phrases. "This is a dream," he said in French. This field, all of this. I can't get hurt in my dream." He added the last part hoping she would believe him. It looked like the dirty man dressed as a knight had been hurt. Really, really hurt. He could smell the odor of an unwashed body drifting across the meadow, an acrid stench almost like stale urine. And then he remembered dead bodies released fluids and crap when they died, since the muscles holding it all in relaxed. Jim wondered if intense smells were an intricate part of this dream. "I have had the dreams too," the girl said. She lowered the sword. "I follow my dreams which tell me I can't be hurt." She held out her hand to help him up. "Angolese?" "American." Jim took her hand and stood beside her. It was calloused and rough, hands used to working. "American?" She struggled to pronounce the word. She was almost as tall as Jim but carried herself in a regal manner that made him feel smaller by comparison. She had a glow, a sort of inner peace that radiated confidence. Jim couldn't look at her directly, but whether it was because of the confidence, or the fact that he had just seen her topless a few moments ago, he wasn't sure. She grabbed the rest of her clothes from a pile beside the pond. Where there is one, there are sure to be more. She walked over to the dead body and began taking pouches from it. She pulled a knife from a sheath and held it out to Jim. He took it without a word. Satisfied with the poaching, she started down a well-beaten path. She stopped at the tree line and looked back at him expectantly. Jim followed. What else could he do? It was his dream after all. She led him forward on the path through the woods. Sunlight leaked through the leafy canopy, creating a patchwork quilt of shadows. He noticed she was sensitive to her surroundings, her eyes constantly roving the tree line, the path ahead, and scanning back at Jim. He thought she looked like a hunted creature. Why am I dreaming in French? He wondered. He had never heard of anyone dreaming in a foreign language, though he suspected it might happen, especially before a big test. What student wouldn't have nightmares about that? He wouldn't, he was sure, because language came so easily to him. He spoke 4, including English, but it wasn't hard for him to learn. He had memorized the root words in 3 Romance languages, French, Spanish, and Italian, which had so many words in common it made learning even easier. He supposed that familiarity with those words would probably make it easy to learn Latin, but hadn't had the chance to explore it yet. Still, he could understand some Latin, some German, and planned to learn Chinese at some point. But why French in this dream? Why not German? Why was he dreaming about this pretty girl with her buzz-shorn hair and not Melody or Heidi Klum or Bar Raphael? If one was going to dream, why not go the distance and traipse across the countryside with a swimsuit model? Not that the young girl in front of him couldn't have been a swimsuit model. He could recall in vivid detail what she looked like before she slid into her shirt, and tried to banish the thoughts as his cheeks stained crimson. She was attractive, and strong, even if unapproachable. She had rounded shoulders and long limbs and walked with the lithe grace of a ballerina. She was thin but muscled, and Jim couldn't help but notice that the thick leather vest stopped just short of a finely shaped bottom. The woolen leggings were almost like yoga pants, clinging in just the right way as she rhythmically moved up and down, side to side. He couldn't make out her panty lines. She stopped. He looked up, caught the crimson spots on his cheeks growing purple. He rushed an apology to his lips, but she held up a finger. She wasn't looking at him. The path carved away from them further ahead, sliding behind a screen of trees and dense underbrush. She glared at the underbrush. What is it? Jim stammered. She shushed him and dropped into a stealth stance. He dropped beside her. She crept forward, carefully checking each step before putting any weight on the foot. It was a silent approach, and even the woods were quiet. Jim tried to imitate her, and put his feet in her footsteps. They inched up the path and hid on the edge of the tree line behind a packed jumble of briars and bushes. On the other side of a small clearing, 3 soldiers lounged in a small circle around the middle of the path. The oldest soldier was gray-haired, and wiry, a sparse mustache covering his upper lip. The other 2 soldiers were younger, barely yet men, indistinguishable from each other except one was heavier. The oldster held his hand above his head, shook his fist and cast several dice on the ground. Quietly, the 2 younger soldiers groaned. They tossed coins on the ground in front of the old man. He scooped up the dice and rolled again. This time, he groaned. He flicked several coins from a pile in front of him. The younger men caught up the coins and clenched them tightly. The old man rolled again. The girl stepped around the briars and waited for them to notice her. They were caught up in the dice on the ground and didn't look up. She drew her sword, slowly. The old man rolled and won. She took a step toward them, edging her boot through the soft dirt, never lifting it off of the ground. The old man lost. She lifted the sword over her head, like a goddess of vengeance. The old man shook his fist over his head and rolled. The girl whipped her sword through the air, slicing the 3 dice before they landed. The soldiers fell back, scrambled to draw their swords. The girl towered over the trio, her blade leveled at them. "Is this your vigilance?" she asked. "The maid," the old man said. "If I were the Ingles, you would be dead," she warned them. "We were able to march up here like a squad of infantry, making more noise than a wounded deer, and you, the men who are to guard our flanks, didn't hear a thing. Are we safe with you here?" The heavy younger man tried to stand up, tripped over his smaller companion. "We would have been ready," he said, looking up at her. She laughed in his face. "I want you to be ready still. I have just fought an Ingles by the water. Where there is one, more will follow. The three soldiers looked at the woods behind her, eyes darted from Jim to the trees. The English were in the woods and could be on them in a moment, and they were sporting dice. They withered under the maid's glare. "I will send others to help you," she said. "We can do it," the old man said, but he refused to meet her gaze. "I need men I can rely on," she answered. "You can rely on us," he said. "I will," she promised. The three men visibly relaxed. They helped each other stand, adjusted their armor and stood vigil on the pathway to watch the woods intensely. "Shall we escort your prisoner?" the old man asked her. She stole a look over her shoulder at Jim. "He's not my prisoner. I don't know what he is yet, but he's not a prisoner." She turned back to the oldster. "I will send more men to reinforce you. If the English come this way, send a runner for me." He nodded. She motioned for Jim to follow her. The soldiers stared at him as he walked past. He wore no armor, carried no sword, and was dressed in strange attire. Maybe he was a wizard, or a warrior priest, like the maid's bodyguard back at the camp. They were just foot soldiers, and gave it little thought. They stood guard on the path, ready for the other men to join them. With extra eyes to watch the woods, they could continue their game. The maid led Jim to the end of the beaten path where it spilled into a large field covered with camping soldiers. The men gathered around sputtering campfires in groups of 6s and 8s, talking, laughing, wiping down their steel weapons. They watched the young duo weave between the fireside chats. The maid smiled or nodded at each group, and they acknowledged her with a reverent air. The men eyed him with suspicion, but no one said anything or made a move against him. Jim marveled at the vivid detail this dream was taking on. The smell of so many unwashed sweaty bodies overwhelmed him, numbing his sense, making his eyes water. The men had so many varying degrees of difference, he wondered where in his brain he came up with it. He had flown in his dreams, he had solved quadratic equations that troubled the best minds of the world, he had seen inventions that, well, he could only dream about, and dutifully recorded every remembered aspect in his dream journal. But this dream outstripped all others for its sheer enormity. He tried to take it all in as he walked after the young girl. Some men were wounded, their limbs covered in blood-soaked bandages. Others had boots with no soles, the leather worn through. Clothing was woven cloth, some finer than others, some little more than rags held together by the barest of threads. There was facial hair, and crossed eyes, and warts, and rotten teeth. They were young, and old, and every age in between, some armored and armed, others carried scythes and pitchforks, and long sticks. This was every aspect of a medieval army, in all of its glory and imperfection, and Jim noticed everything. Why would I dream of a medieval army? He wondered. He had studied medieval Europe over a year ago in a special studies group he took at the community college on weekends. It was his mother's idea, to keep him challenged, even as he stayed with his same age group at his school. Every weekend, he would attend several classes offered at the university, and some weeknights, she let him attend continued learning courses at the community center. When you finish all of the class's homework for the year in the first week of school, they had to find something to keep you occupied. His mother found it in outside education. He could do all of the self-study he wanted, but he liked the environment of learning with others around, even if it was only to impress them with how much he knew. So he went to school, a lot, and loved every minute of it. Medieval Europe was taught by a dithering professor who wrote a great book 20 years ago and lived off of the reputation. He didn't examine any new facts or facets of history, accepting that his old view was good enough for them to learn. He hated Jim, at least that was how the boy felt every time he asked a question in class. Still, the professor had a great overview of the time period and Jim enjoyed the exchange. "Funny how the brain just brings stuff to the surface like that in a dream world," he said. "Did you say something?" the maid asked him. "No," he answered, and looked up. They had reached the center of the encampment, a collection of tents surrounded by a guarded barricade. Groups of commanders stopped poring over maps to watch the maid march through the entrance. Jim stood at the edge of the thorn fence and stared at the sea of men everywhere. Smoke drifted in the air from 1,000 campfires, making the daylight almost twilight. The noise of so many men was a dull roar, a constant hum punctuated by the snorts and screams of horses, and the clang of metal on metal. He let his eyes wander to the edge of the camp. On the far side of the encampment, a group trained in exercises under the watchful eye of a giant bald man in black armor. He rode a huge stallion draped in black tapestry, yelling at the men, encouraging or chastising, Jim couldn't tell. "Who is this?" a general asked the maid. This is who I found in the woods, she said. The men looked at her cryptically and studied Jim. He stood up straight. No need to show any fear to these armor-clad men holding swords, he thought, not in a dream at least. One man stood apart from the rest, a crest on the shoulders on his cloak. This is my general, said Joan as she introduced him. The man moved quickly to Jim. I am Alençon, the general said to Jim. These are my advisors. Jim Jones, he said and held out his hand. Alençon stared at his empty palm and motioned to an aide. He handed a mug of water to the Jim. The walk made you thirsty? Jim took the water, smelled the cup and sipped it slowly. The maid took the cup away from him and drained the contents. I did not know your name, she said. Jim, he offered again. I am Joan. Puzzle pieces fell into place. Medieval army, French-speaking soldiers led by a young girl. Jim wondered why he was dreaming about Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. This was one of the armies she would lead into battle. How goes the planning? She asked, wiping her mouth with the hem of her shirt. Well, said Alençon and glanced at Jim. Joan saw his stare. He is a dreamer, she said, as if that was enough. And what if he dreams for the English? We will let Renard decide, she said. The fox is training, one of the advisors spoke up. And you should be planning, chastised the maid. What manner of trouble have you developed for the English? Alençon turned back to the map, but before he did he gave Jim the once-over once again. Talbot is at Patay, just outside of Orleans. His men are spread across the valley proper. They are on a small rise, our men must labor uphill to meet their defenses. Can we draw them out to meet us? She asked. Renard suggested as much, but it is a plan you used in the last battle. I think they will be waiting for it. She nodded. What of the fortress? Our spies say Talbot's personal army will stay behind the walls. His men are well trained. It will be a long siege. I am not worried, she said. I have it on good authority that we will prevail. She looked up at the sky. The general and his advisors laughed. I met an English in the woods, she said. Send extra men back along the path to enforce our sentries. Alençon motioned to a runner, who sprinted from the commander's camp. Jim noted a small squad of soldiers geared up and marched into the woods almost immediately. The men are ready, said Alençon. The longer we sit here, the less prepared they are. Renard and I argued this with you, said Joan. We will let the English wait. We have out off their roads. They sit in the castle and eat their supplies. Soon enough, you will want to quit the battle and go back to planning. You may be right, said Alençon. But all of the planning is for naught if supplies get through. But that is what I plan against, smiled Joan. She moved to the edge of the barricade and stared across the camp. Renard, the giant in black armor, stopped wheeling about on his horse and raised an arm. Joan waved back. Jim, she said. Yes? Let's introduce you to the fox. Jim had read many books about great men. He had an entire shelf in his room full of biographies about the men and women who made history. One day he hoped to be one. He knew that great men were often made, creations of their environment, using their natural talents to rise above their fellow man. Some were gifted with extraordinary abilities, some with outstanding looks, others with otherworldly presence. Jim knew he possessed some of the qualities that if used properly, could make him a great man. He could invent, and make connections, and think, which many people didn't do. He knew that one day, he might make a difference in his world. So it was with little surprise that he met such a man in his dream world. Renard was a giant man, made more intimidating by the coal-black armor that he wore like a second skin. He sat astride a giant ebon stallion and observed Joan approach with her passenger on the back of a small pawn. Maid, Renard said, lowering his head. Renard, she answered. Renard had a gentle face, broken by a crimson scar that split his visage from forehead to opposite cheek. His head was shaved bald, the stubble of a day's growth darkening the suntanned scalp. His eyes were hard and sharp, noticing everything. He wore two swords, a huge two-handed broadsword across his back, and a smaller short sword at his side. He climbed down from the stallion and still towered over the maid and Jim. How goes the training? Joan asked. These men are ready for anything, he said loudly. The soldiers shuffled their feet, glowing in the overheard praise. Then can you break them for the day? Have you had enough? Renard called to them. A commander stepped forward. Once more, if you please, sir, he said, and the men agreed. Have at it, Renard said. But without me. I am called by a higher voice. The men laughed and paced through their training maneuvers again. Joan put her arm through Renard's and led him away from the men. Jim trailed behind them. Who is this? Renard asked. This is Jim, a dreamer, she answered. Renard studied him. Your dress is funny, he said. You should see how you look to me, Jim answered. Dreamers often dress according to a different law, said Renard, indicating Joan. A dress would do me no good in battle, she teased. It might distract the English, he answered. I am distraction enough, she replied. Renard nodded. What do you dream, Jim Dreamer? He asked. Jim motioned to the whole encampment surrounding them. All of it, he said. Renard raised a bushy eyebrow, looking at Joan. He dreams as you do. She nodded. All of this is her doing, said Renard. This maid from the woods went to the king and told him to give her an army. If he did, she would give him the crown. We are close to it. The Dauphin, said Jim. Crowned Charles VII in Reims in 1429. All because of her. Then you believe in the dream, said Renard. As do I. I was Dauphin's bodyguard, the captain of his personal guard. He commanded me to watch over this one. And he does his job well, Joan told Jim. Almost too well. It's not often that the English make it to me to fight. Your armor makes you a target, he countered. And yours? She said, touching his large arm. Mine intimidates. It works, said Jim. When does Alençon want to move? Said Renard. I told him soon. He is all plans and ready for action. I said to consult with you. Renard looked at the army of men encircling them. We are ready. I would that we had an edge, something to overwhelm the English when we meet. They have the field advantage. I have an idea, said Jim. You dreamer? You will contribute to this battle too? Jim shrugged. How much damage could someone do in a dream? Renard thundered into the command camp, drew his war stallion up. A page ran out and grabbed the reins to lead it to the corral as Joan galloped in behind him. Jim slipped off the back of the pony. He tried to stand taller next to Renard, but the giant towered over him by head and shoulders. No wonder he's the king's best bodyguard, thought Jim. He's a foot taller than the tallest man here. Alençon and the advisors came out of a tent and waited for the giant and the maid at the edge of the table map. We have word, said Alençon. The fortress is getting a supply wagon train, coming from Burgundy. Renard considered the map. We have the squad trained. They will rest tonight, and tomorrow move on the train. Those supplies must not reach the fortress. How long have you trained? Asked Joan. All of this day. Then your men are tired. They will not be fully effective in battle, she said. It is only a supply train, the giant countered. An important supply train. It will be heavily guarded, she looked to Alençon for confirmation. He nodded. Cavalry, archers and 2 columns of foot, front and rear. Your men are not enough. Are we stealing the supplies or just preventing them from reaching the castle? Asked Renard. One and the same, said an advisor. We will do what we must, said Joan. Then give me more men, fresh men, and I will go stop them. I will go with you, said Joan. I must object, said Aelnoon. You are needed here. What if the raid is not a success? I can handle one supply train, said Renard. Of that I have no doubt. But can you disable the supplies and protect the maid as you are pledged to do, at the same time? Renard considered. I do not need his protection all of the time, countered Joan. I will take the dreamer with me, and together, we will help the fox. She turned to Jim. What say you, dreamer? I think I have an idea, he answered. He could feel the reverberations of the foot soldiers marching long before he could see them. There were not that many, 50 or so in the front, another 50 in the rear. 20 knights on horses trotted beside 3 wagons loaded down with food, weapons, and supplies. 15 archers marched directly behind the 3rd wagon, staying out of the ruts in the path. Jim watched them from the top of a tree, beside Renard. He hadn't wanted to climb, But when the giant man clambered up the tree like a monkey, he followed. "Now would be a good time to hear your idea," said Renard. "How much do they hate Joan?" asked Jim. "They know she is our heart. To they take the maid is to take France. It's simple, then. We bait them with Joan." Renard growled low in his throat. "It's a tactic I have used before. They may be ready for it." "Not if we do it right," smiled Jim. The lead soldier in the English convoy trudged along, downcast on the rutted pathway before him. He was alert to the sounds of the forest, but after several days of nothing at all, he was weary. They had been warned to expect resistance, but so far, the French were quartered on the far side of the castle, intent on the upcoming battle. When this supply train arrived, it would delay the battle longer, forcing the French to forage further away to feed their large army. "An army has to eat," his father was fond of telling him. He knew it to be true, for he spent most of his time in the service hungry. He blamed it on the maid. He had been a farmer before some young girl came out of the woods claiming visions of glory. She was the motivation for his lord to activate his service. Otherwise, he would be spending his days in his fields, instead of marching from one part of the world to the next. All of the English felt that way, except for the mercenaries, who got paid to march or fight either way. It was the maid's fault. He looked up at the road ahead. Topping the rise, a woman warrior in white armor on a small pony pulled up short. "The maid," the soldier said. The woman reared the pony around and raced away from them. "The maid!" the soldier cried. His comrades took up the cry. They gave chase, trotted after her, leaving the supply wagon stalled in the path. The cavalry heard their cry, and raced after the smaller pony. Their large war horses closed the gap quickly. The archers put arrows to bow and waited. French soldiers, covered in dirt and leaves, stood up from hiding places on both sides of the path. The English were dumbfounded. Where there had been ground, now there were French. The two sides moved on each other, but surprise was on the French side. They overwhelmed the English and took prisoners. Joan pushed her pony hard, but still the English knights gained on her. She turned her pony around in a small copse, and drew her sword waiting. The cavalry pounded in, surrounding her. "We have you, girl," leered the lead knight. "You have nothing," she challenged. Renard charged out of the woods, both swords drawn. The knights turned to face him. A French archer leaned from behind each tree, surrounding the knights with bristling arrows. "Surrender," shouted Renard. The knights threw down their swords. Joan hopped on her pony, trotted over to Jim and pulled him up behind her. "Good work," Renard called to him. "If your idea for the siege works as well as your taking the supply train, we will have it easy," said Joan. She, Jim and Renard pored over the map with Alençon and his advisors. "A minor victory at best," said Alençon. "We should not place our whole plan in jeopardy for this." "I will hear what he says," said Renard. "He has proven himself in battle." "I didn't do anything," said Jim. "We didn't lose one man," said Joan. "A bloodless battle is a worthy claim." "I don't think we can do it for a siege," said Jim. "A bloodless battle, I mean." "One life saved, is one more Frenchman to build this country," said Joan. "Any of your help is welcome." Jim scrutinized the crude drawing in front of him. "We could try the same tactic as before," he offered. "I don't like putting you in danger, but if they saw your white armor and charged, we could draw out their line. Put your artillery cannons along here, and catch them in a crossfire." "Crossfire?" said Alençon. "We'll shoot our own men." "He is crazy." "No, I mean, look. Place your cannons at angles, so that they don't fire straight across, but this way," he demonstrated. "I agree," said Renard. "Moving our cannons will give us the advantage. We engage tomorrow." "And sacrificing the maid? You agree with that?" Alençon argued. "I will not be sacrificed," said Joan. "I will lead this army into battle. A small number of men will accompany me. We will draw them out, just as Jim says." "I hope," Jim muttered under his breath. Morning dawned with the French soldiers lined up at the edge of the forests encircling the fields of Patay. Talbot's army occupied the top of the hill and the land leading back to Orleans. Joan stood beside Renard under a tree in the wood. "Do not worry," she said. "They are good men." "I should go with you," he pleaded. "You are needed here." He hung his head. She put her hand on his forehead, holding it, then traced a finger down the side of his scarred face. "Watch the dreamer for me," she said. Joan mounted her small pony. Her white armor gleamed in the rising sun. She raised her sword and 20 men followed her out of the forest. At the sight of her, the English lines started buzzing, the soldiers jeered and yelled taunts. They called out to her, threats and wicked promises, which were lost in the distance. The rest of the French army stepped out of the woods and slowly advanced after Joan, all according to a deliberate plan. Joan increased the distance between her group of men and the army behind her. She led her men in a charge toward the frontmost English line. Too late, she saw the foot soldiers on both English flanks part. She stalled her advance, as English cavalry pounded down the hill, swinging behind her in a pincer move. The English had used the French plan on her. Her small group of men was cut off from her army, and the knights closed in. Renard screamed. He mounted his huge stallion, gripped a mighty sword in each hand and charged toward Joan's group. His men followed after, engaged the English in battle. Joan's men fought hard, pressed her to the center, and protected her in their circle. Jim stood on the edge of the woods, watched, and tried to fight the feeling of helplessness that threatened to overwhelm him. His plan had failed, or rather, it had worked in reverse. The English had used the maneuver. Someone in the French camp was a spy. Joan was trapped. Renard struggled to reach her side, cleaving a path among the knights and foot soldiers, but there were many men between them. If the English captured Joan, the tide of battle would turn for the English. The French would lose heart. Jim ran for an artillery battery. He reached the leader of the group. "Change range," he ordered. "Who are you?" the leader asked. Jim grabbed a stick, scribbled equations in the. "How much does your shot weigh?" he asked. "What do you want with it?" the leader asked back. "There's not time," Jim argued. "I'm trying to save the maid." "Why didn't you say?" the leader asked. "It's 12-pound shot." Jim scribbled furiously. "Turn the cannon this way," he helped the men move the artillery piece. "Lower the barrel 2 degrees. "We can't go lower, we'll hit our own men." "No you won't. Look, I can't explain. Just do it." "The barrel is fixed," said the leader. Jim looked around. He grabbed 2 shot balls and shoved them under the artillery tongue, cradling it. It wouldn't be too secure, but it only had to last 1 or 2 shots. "Fire!" he screamed. The leader put flame to the wick. Seconds ticked by. Finally, the cannon roared. The shot sailed over the heads of the screaming fighters and smashed into the English command tent. "Do it again," Jim shouted and ran away from the artillery. The men cradled the tongue and prepared to fire again. All of Joan's men were down or captured. She fought alone, from the back of her pony, laying about with her sword and standard, trying to hold back the tide of English that threatened to overwhelm her. A man made it to her leg, grabbed her and dragged her off of the pony. The English closed in. A black demon whirled into the group of men, smashing and tearing among the bodies. Renard was a man possessed. He sent men flying, hacking a path to Joan. He pulled her on the back of his horse. He fought on one side, she the other. And still the English kept coming. Jim saw Renard pull Joan on the back of his stallion. They were surrounded by English, with no French soldiers close enough to help. He spied an empty wagon at the edge of the battle. The nervous horses danced in their traces. Jim sprinted across the battlefield, scooped up swords from fallen soldiers. He jumped in the back of the wagon, grabbed the reins from the seat. "Go!" he screamed at the horses, and aimed for Joan and Renard. As the horses ran, he shoved swords through the sideboards. The wagon was small, the kind used to carry shot from one artillery sight to the next. He was able to stick 3 swords from each sideboard, razor-sharp blades on a moving scythe. He grabbed the reins and hid behind the seat, steering by sighting between the bottom of the wagon and the top of the seat. The horses tore through the fighting men and mowed a path through the press of bodies. No one stood in the razor-wrapped wagon's course as it sliced through the battle. "Joan!" Jim screamed. She saw him coming, and reached for the reins in Renard's hands. She dug in her heels, nudged the stallion toward him. Jim struggled to turn the wagon, to clear a path for Renard to follow. He led Joan and the giant to safety at the edge of the woods. "Thank you," said Joan as she jumped off the side of the horse. "Impressive," smiled Renard as he admired the war wagon. "It's the best I could do on such short notice." Joan motioned for runners from the woods. "Direct the artillery to hit the commander's tent again," she said. That was inspired, she told Jim. The battle may go our way yet, said Renard. Our plans were known, Joan growled. We have a spy in our camp. Alençon trotted up on a horse, followed by his advisor. I feared you were taken, he said to Joan. I could not reach you with my men. I do not worry so long as the fox is near, she told him. We have a traitor in our midst, said Renard. Really? Said Alençon. How do you know? The English knew Jim's plan. They executed it on us. Alençon got off of his horse, moved to stand beside Jim. The young man did his best not to back down from the towering man. Then perhaps we have found our spy, he suggested. I'm not a spy, Jim said. I know you're not, Joan agreed. We know who is our betrayer. Alençon grabbed Jim by the lapels. I tell you it is him. Jim's tablet fell out of his pocket, landed on the ground. What is this? Alençon picked up the unit. Every spy has his gadgetry. Surely this is of English design. Jim grabbed for the unit, but Alençon held it out of reach. I'm not a spy, Jim said again. I think it's him. I accuse you, you accuse me, sneered Alençon. My little boy, you're going to have to do much better than that. I can't, Jim realized. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to accomplish his goals. He knew Alençon was working for the English, but he had no proof. He couldn't think of a formula to calculate the level of duplicity the man possessed. He didn't know of a precedent, or a book that explained how it happened, which he could quote. He only knew in his heart that this man was evil. And all he could do was say it. He wanted to wake up. He turned to Joan and pleaded. Joan, it's not me. Joan smiled at him. She glowed with inner peace and confidence. Dreamer, she said softly. I know it's not you. It's not in your pure heart. Renard drew his short sword, leveled it at Alençon. Release the boy. Alençon pulled Jim in front of him, covered his chest with the hand holding the tablet. Jim grabbed it. I will not be betrayed by a boy and a girl, Alençon spat. Renard advanced on him. Jim grabbed the tablet, and twisted away from Alençon. He accidentally hit the on switch on the unit. A blue light flashed in front of him. Alençon flinched, shoved him forward, into the light. Jim fell through the light. He splashed into a dark dank mud hole. Jim struggled to sit up, sputtered. Someone next to him whispered. Shh. You got to be quiet. Behind him, hound dogs howled. He wondered why the dream had changed. The end.